Okay, in this part three, the last set of slides about classical conditioning, we're going to talk about a case study, G. This is a case that I worked on several years ago. Right. So here's some details about G, and keep in mind that I'm presenting this as an example of classical conditioning causing a problem and using classical conditioning or what we know about counter conditioning to try to solve a problem. So look for some evidence of what you think might be going on here that fits a classical conditioning paradigm. So G was a 5-year-old girl who, because of medical issues present since birth, had not learned to swallow solid food. G was fed through a tube inserted into her stomach. At age 5, G had no physical problems that would prevent her from swallowing solid food, but because she had not done so at a developmentally appropriate time, she now had a hypersensitive gag reflex. So this is common for children that have, especially if they've had early medical intervention, which was the case with G. That they're not able for other reasons to begin oral feeding at a certain time. And because they didn't, then as the musculature and the develops that's involved in eating, it becomes hypersensitive because it's not accustomed to being used in the way that it was meant to be used. And the body has a great way of protecting itself, and that at a certain point that it's a natural protection to not want something to go down there if you're not physically able to manipulate it in your mouth and feel safe about it. So look for answers to these questions on the next slide. Right? Again, this is an example of classical conditioning, both in the nature of the problem, but also in the way that we conceptualize the intervention. So is there an unconditioned response? What's the UCR, UCS, CR, and CS? Okay. All right, so here's the problem. In first attempt to feed G solid food, this was me feeding, she allowed the spoon with food into her mouth and immediately began coughing, gagging, and eventually vomiting. After a few attempts, G refused to open her mouth for the spoon. In subsequent attempts to feed her, she would begin to say no, begin to cry, often begin gagging, and sometimes leave the room when she saw her parents preparing food and setting a place for her at the table. She quickly learned to watch for any sign that they would be trying to feed her. All right, so let's go back through this again. Remember what we're looking for. We're looking for stimuli and we're looking for responses. Okay, first attempt to feed G solid food, she allowed spoon with the food into her mouth and immediately began coughing, gagging, and eventually vomiting. Okay, so that's a reflex, right? And you don't have to learn that. That's your body's way of protecting. Not great writing with this thing, but there's your UCR right there, okay? So if that's the unconditioned response, well, I think it's the unconditioned response, then we think I can make the argument, then what would be the stimulus, all right? So the conditioned stimulus was a spoon with food into her mouth. So basically anything that would go into her mouth past a certain point would elicit this coughing, gagging, eventually vomiting. She didn't have to learn this. It wasn't paired with something else. So here we have our UCS and our UCR. Okay. So after a few attempts, G refused to open her mouth to the spoon. In subsequent attempts to feed her, she would begin to say no, begin to cry, often begin gagging, and sometimes leave the room when she saw her parents preparing food and setting a place for her at the table. So after a few attempts, she put her mouth. In subsequent attempts to feed her, she would begin to say no, begin to cry, and often begin gagging, and sometimes leaving the room, crying, all this upset behavior, including the gagging, but there's no food in her mouth, right? Because we haven't gotten that far yet. So that can't, so that's, it looks like it's the unconditioned response, but it's not happening in the presence of the unconditioned stimulus. So I think let's call that the conditioned response, right? So if you have a conditioned response, now you have to figure out what's the conditioned stimulus. Well, in this case, let's look at attempts to feed her. And then she saw her parents preparing food and setting a place for her at the table. She quickly learned to watch for any sign they would be trying to feed her. Okay. So here's what happened with this child, and this is not uncommon, is that all of these stimuli that were associated with attempts to feed her came to elicit the conditioned response, which was included the gagging, but also included all this other emotional behavior also related, uh, made her very uncomfortable, right? So keep looking back. So we have the conditioned stimulus because these are all paired with the attempt to put food in her mouth, and so you can see the situation that we have going here, right? So what to do with this? That's the question. So we thought long and hard about um, the fact that from a treatment standpoint, there was no way for us to teach her how to relax, for example, in the example I gave you before, to just say, we're going to teach you to relax so that when the food goes into your mouth that you won't cough and gag. Because we just don't really, relaxation wasn't going to help in that case, all right? Couldn't control that. So here's what we did do. Try to make it better in other sorts of ways that we can control. So we removed all the conditioned stimuli, all those things that were associated with mealtime. It's funny because these are things that you and I probably really like, right? The smell of the food, the routine, hearing someone in the kitchen, the setting of the table, um, perhaps someone asking us what we would like for dinner. All those are positive things, but for G, they were not. And so we had to change the whole routine and remove all those conditioned stimuli and replace them with neutral, or what we hoped were preferred stimuli, to prevent the conditioned response from occurring. So what we didn't want is for her to begin to become upset and gag before there was actually any food introduced. So what did she had to look? She happened to like this particular cartoon that had a dinosaur in it or something, and so we played that over and over and over again. So we tried to put her in a situation. We took everything out. We changed up the mealtime and such. So because we couldn't, like I said before, we couldn't prevent the UCR. We changed the UCS. Right? So we changed the utensil, the food, and the presentation. Okay. So we had been trying to feed her yogurt at that time. So we changed the color, the type. Um, we got a different kind of a utensil that was smaller. And I think this was really important. We let her have her hand on the spoon so that she had more control rather than me putting up there. And then we introduced pleasant stimuli to compete with the UCS and possibly reduce the arousal. I think that part might have gotten cut off from your slide, but um, so we had distractions. We had her sit in the living room instead of at the table at the kitchen. We fed her at a different time. Um, we had her favorite cartoon going. She had toys around her that she really liked. So we were doing everything we could. We couldn't, again, we can't change it. We couldn't reach in there. We couldn't access um, the interior of her mouth and throat and stop the UCR. So we had to actually help her um, not elicit the UCR, or at least as strongly. Okay. So this is what we chose to do. Kind of, so it's kind of multi-pronged. Right? Oh, and I should tell you. So, well, I would have to say we spent the better part of a summer, and by the end of the summer, she was able to eat soft. She was able to eat several bites of soft food, yogurt, some cereals, and some pudding. And as long as we managed to keep the amounts that went in really small, then she wouldn't gag. But I have to tell you that if something happened and she ended up having another gagging attack, it would set us back another week. So it's that um, when we were able to have the the conditioned stimulus, the spoon and the food going in, when we were able to not have that elicit the um, the response, and we could do that for several times. It got better, and the more food that went into her mouth and that she swallowed, then the more desensitized she came. So, but it took a long, long time. But it was really important because if you know about nutrition, you know that it's difficult to maintain growth and gain weight on just being tube fed, that we really want to develop oral feeding. All right, the last slide in this section, and this is an example that I don't know if you've eaten clams before, but I'm pretty sure you've eaten something that uh, made you sick. It either made you sick because there was something wrong with it, or it made you sick because you happen to already be sick, or you ate too much, or something. And so this happens to be an example of clams, which I don't particularly like anyway. But uh, so you can see at the side of the clams, no problem. But now we have clams and sickness and nausea, and after that, just the sight of the clams makes you nauseous. Okay. Right? And so if we want to treat this, what we would say is that we'd have to do some desensitization, right? And so you'd have to be able to somehow relax and and not feel nausea. Do something instead of feeling nausea in the presence of a small amount, one clam or something like that, until gradually you would be desensitized. So that's how conditioned taste aversions occur. That's it for this set of slides and for classical conditioning. And in the next set, we'll move into operant conditioning.